Welcome back to the Daily Drum on WHUR 96.3 HD2 and Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue our week-long series getting you ready for Election Day, Tuesday, November 5th. Now, tonight, it's all about knowing and protecting your voter rights, what to expect at the polls, and what to do if you run into a problem. We are talking about election protection. My guest is Ryan Snow, counsel with the Voting Rights Project of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Ryan, thank you so much for joining the conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Harold. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, first of all, let me share a few fun facts. We know already that more than 55 million people have already cast ballots in this year's election. 39% of those voters are registered Democrats, about 36% are registered Republicans. 100 million people voted early in 2020, either in person or by mail. And of course, if you run into a problem voting, you can call Election Protections Hotline at 866-OUR-VOTE. We're definitely going to talk about that as well. And just a reminder, for Maryland voters, today is the last day for early voting in Maryland. Let me first ask you about yesterday's headline, Ryan. It was big news about the Supreme Court's decision to allow the Commonwealth of Virginia to remove about 1,600 voters from the rolls. You were a part of that legal case. Kind of break it down for us as to what happened yesterday.
Sure. So the Lawyers Committee, together with co-counsel, was representing the plaintiffs in the case, which are the Virginia Coalition for Immigrant Rights, the League of Women Voters of Virginia, and African Communities Together, all of whom are involved in advocacy among immigrant communities to encourage naturalized citizens to vote. And we learned on August 7th, Governor Youngkin had issued an executive order that was, contained some intimidating language about, prosecuting people, and also accelerated the process for removing people from the rolls on the basis that they are suspected of being non-citizens. So as we started investigating this, we realized that a lot of people are getting flagged as potential non-citizens on a basis that really has nothing to do with their actual citizenship. So, we worked together to do this investigation. We ended up filing suit. And we were able to confirm that this was an unlawful voter purge and that it was removing eligible voters from the rolls, both naturalized citizens and U.S.-born citizens from the rolls. I'm happy to get into some details. Let me just say first, we had a hearing a week ago today on our motion for preliminary injunction, which would have restored those 1,600 voters who were unlawfully removed to the rolls. We received a favorable ruling. The district court judge, granted our motion for preliminary injunction on Friday and gave the Commonwealth 5 days to comply with the order, which would have included restoring those 1,600 who were unlawfully purged and sending corrective letters to those 1,600, making clear that they were still registered and that they could vote if they were eligible. Preliminary injunction the deadline would have been yesterday. Of course, the Commonwealth appealed to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals for an emergency stay of the preliminary injunction. And the Court of Appeals, in a unanimous 3-judge ruling, agreed with the district court that this was a clear case of a violation of the National Voter Registration Act's prohibition on systematic voter purges within 90 days of an election. What systematic means is that whatever the input is that gets a voter flagged as potentially ineligible, there has to be some kind of individualized investigation to confirm that information before they get placed on the path to removal. And the reason that both the district court and the Circuit Court of Appeals found that this was a clear case of a systematic removal, which again is a violation of the NVRA, National Voter Registration Act, within 90 days of an election, is because there was no individualized process for investigation. Voters were placed on the path for removal based on one of two factors. First, about 1,200 were placed on the path to removal on the basis that they had in their DMV record a document that indicated that when they obtained their driver's license, they were not a citizen. Virginia provides driver's license. Virginia provides the same up to 8-year driver's license to lawful permanent residents as it does to citizens. And this document will always be on the individual's record, even if they later become a citizen. DMV doesn't update those records, and neither does the Department of Elections. So what happens in many cases is somebody will come to the United States, become a lawful permanent resident, obtain a driver's license, they're living and working, and then they will become a naturalized citizen. They will register to vote. They'll often even provide their naturalization certificate with their voter registration form. And then they will be registered to vote. They'll, obviously lawful voters voting for years. I spoke with one individual who became a citizen over 30 years ago and has been voting, frequently. Voting is very important to him. And he had never had an issue with voting, never been removed from the rolls. And all of a sudden he's removed from the rolls in this election. So definitely an issue there. The other bucket of people who were removed because they checked the wrong box at the DMV. So when you're at the DMV, you're working on an electronic kiosk, you're updating your driver's license, sometimes moving very quickly. As you can imagine, the kiosk is very small. So certainly if you have any, if you're English language learners or older folks who might have trouble reading it, or just anyone who's in a rush and not getting clear instructions from the clerk behind the counter, clicking through this pad, click the wrong box that indicates that they were not a citizen. And then that again goes to the Department of Elections, and they will then pass it on to the local registrars who generate a notice for removal. The problem is, in neither of these cases was there any truly individualized review that would have confirmed somebody's citizenship status. With the checkbox issue, by definition, any registered voter in Virginia has affirmed their citizenship, and nothing more is required. There's no documentary proof of citizenship requirement. So these are all people who at least once had affirmed their citizenship. Many of them many times. Every time they'd updated their driver's license, every time they'd updated their voter registration for a new address, they have to reaffirm their citizenship. So what we were hearing, especially from some of the local registrars, was they have on the person's voter file, they can see that this person has reaffirmed their citizenship, 5-10 times over the years, and yet this one new data point is going to put them on the path to removal. So that was what made it systematic. That was what the district court found, and the Court of Appeals upheld as being clearly systematic. And yet the Supreme Court turned around yesterday, and without explanation, there was no reasoning in their order. It was not a signed order. They simply summarily granted the stay just before the state would have had to put those individuals back on the rolls. So they're not on the rolls. Thankfully, though, Virginia has same-day registration. And so these voters and any other eligible Virginia voters are able to go in person either today or tomorrow for early voting, or on Tuesday, and fill out a same-day registration form and cast a provisional ballot that will be counted once their eligibility is confirmed.
Yep. And I think that is probably one of the most important things, particularly for those who, for whatever reason, mistakenly or otherwise, were removed from the voter rolls. And certainly we've seen some reporting to that effect, where someone who was born here, has always voted, and found herself to be removed from the voter rolls. And so that is the upside to this complex case. And certainly, even though the Supreme Court has the final word, I'm sure it is quite likely that we will continue to see some of these issues pop up, not only before November 5th, but in future voting seasons.
Certainly. And our lawsuit will continue in Virginia. The preliminary injunction was focused only on that 90-day period where Congress recognized in the National Voter Registration Act that systematic programs of removal are more likely to remove eligible voters. We've spoken with dozens of voters who are eligible who were removed, wrongfully removed. And that's why they put a hold on that during that 90-day period. So that's certainly legal issue. Again, we don't know the basis for the Supreme Court's decision, but it's very concerning given that 4 federal judges had found that this is not a close case. This is a very clear violation. But our lawsuit will continue also because, as I mentioned, with that DMV data issue, this is fundamentally discriminatory. The National Voter Registration Act separately requires that any list maintenance programs be uniform and non-discriminatory. And as I mentioned, only naturalized citizens will ever be flagged as potential non-citizens using this outdated DMV data. It will never, U.S. born citizens will never be subject to this extra scrutiny because they will never have had a non-citizen document in their DMV record. So that's fundamentally discriminatory. We're going to continue this lawsuit. There's a lot more investigation to be done. And you're right. There's certainly this is an issue not just in Virginia. A few weeks ago, actually, a federal district court judge in Alabama enjoined a very similar program based on some of the same outdated and unreliable data. Alabama did not appeal that decision. And that in that case, more than 2,000 of the 3,000 some voters who were removed were confirmed to be eligible. So, this is simply this is an unlawful voter purge. And, we need to be focused on ensuring that eligible voters can vote. And, thankfully in Virginia, we have same day registration. So that's hopefully going to be a tool that eligible voters can use between now and Tuesday.
I want to share something that happened on yesterday. There was an incident in Orangeburg, South Carolina. I'll play this for you, and then we'll talk about it on the other side.
Wow. Why is it defending you? It's like it's not. All right, then shut the hell up and let me vote.
Okay, Jamie. Okay, we ain't got nothing else to say. We ain't got nothing else to say.
Wow.
Next thing.
What? There it is right there.
Wow. Oh, wow, God. Oh.
Don't do that.
Wow. 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 Wow.
So as you could see there, that the voter had a hat. It was a "Let's Go Brandon" hat. For those who are not familiar with that phrase, it is a coded insult directed at President Biden. And the investigation that is happening right now in South Carolina has to do not only with that specific incident, but this is an incident regarding electioneering. Obviously, explain to people who are unfamiliar with electioneering what is that, and what does it mean, and why couldn't he wear a Donald Trump hat or a Kamala Harris hat or a Democrat or a Republican T-shirt or something like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so electioneering, broadly speaking, is expressing support for a candidate or a party or a ballot measure or any other political statement or advocacy, and it is prohibited in every state inside polling places, and also usually within a certain distance outside of the polling place, whether it's 40 feet or 50 feet or 150 feet. Each state has different rules there, and so that's why you can't wear political paraphernalia, whether it's a support for a candidate or political slogan like "Let's go Brandon," or something else that expresses support or opposes particular candidate, party, or issue inside polling places, and again within polling places. And so this is an issue. This is an issue in every election. I think it's fair to say that in recent years it has become a bigger issue given the kind of ramping up of rhetoric and the passion and the emotion that people are feeling over what's at stake in these elections. There's another important issue here, which is voter intimidation is illegal in every state and also under federal law. And so there is a line at which electioneering crosses over into intimidation. And one of the ways that can cross over is if you're no longer supporting your candidate, you're starting to attack somebody or berate somebody for supporting their candidate. And, we're certainly seeing that in certain places. And that's actually illegal even outside of the no electioneering line. So not just in the polling place, not just in the area outside that's delineated for people to wait in line. It's actually illegal also outside that line, as is impeding anybody physically from accessing the polls. So blocking a parking lot, for example, with the cars or signs, making a line of people and impeding somebody's progress, to the line and to the booth. And then
Ryan,
also,
if I may, let me interrupt you. Don't forget your thought, but I do need to take a really quick break, and I want you to continue sharing that information on the other side. Don't forget, you can hear this and every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is next. I'm Harold Fisher. This conversation about protecting your vote continues on Sirius XM channel 141 and 96.3 HD2 in just a few seconds. Welcome back to the Daily Drum on Sirius XM channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. We continue our discussion about protecting your vote. My guest is Ryan Snow, counsel with the Voting Rights Project for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Ryan, before the break, we were talking about electioneering. Your specific point was about someone perhaps impeding access to a parking lot of a voting place. Please continue your point.
Sure. So, just broadly speaking, electioneering, supporting a candidate or an issue or a party is, it's First Amendment protected speech. You can do it outside the area surrounding the polling place that's delineated as a no electioneering zone, and you cannot do it within that zone. You cannot do it inside the polling place. But the video you played, and certainly we've heard reports also elsewhere of disruptions and people causing some kind of disruption or disorder within that area. And this can be intimidating for voters. It can also be disruptive of voting for other voters and the poll workers. That certainly seems like what was going on in the video. And that's obviously prohibited. It's obviously illegal. And poll workers have the authority to remove people from the polling place and from the no electioneering zone outside the polling place if they're causing disruptions, if they're causing disorder, and certainly if they are doing anything that might be intimidating to voters, including berating them about their preferred candidate or party or ballot measure or issue or political preferences. So this is certainly something that it's an issue in every election. It's certainly an issue in this election. And it's something that the Election Protection Coalition is very focused on. So the Lawyers Committee works together with more than 300 national, state, and local partners. It's the nation's largest nonpartisan voter protection and voter information service. And we operate a hotline 365 days a year, 7 days a week. It's called 866 Our Vote. And anybody can call that hotline with any question about any aspect of voting in any state. They can also call it to report an issue if they've experienced, if you've experienced, for example, something like we saw in the video, or if you've experienced any kind of aggressive electioneering, or it might be intimidating if you yourself felt intimidated. You can call this number to report it. You can send us pictures and videos that you may have taken. And this helps us follow up with election officials and make sure that voters are being provided with a safe and secure and comfortable environment to vote in. And then we also, would be able to follow up with you, the voter, or others who might have been affected. So that's a great resource. We also operate a large in-person field operation with over 10,000 volunteers working in 34 states to have a presence at polling places, to answer questions from voters, to work with election officials to help maintain order at the polling place and address any issues that might arise, including aggressive electioneering, like the example that you shared.
I want to go back to that example because I know that in polling places in the District of Columbia and in Maryland, and I would imagine I've not been to a polling place in Virginia recently, but I would imagine that there is a great big sign, as we've seen in DC and in Maryland, that says biggest day, no electioneering. Okay. And that means no political paraphernalia, etc. If for some reason a voter has a Democrat or a Republican hat on and no one has stopped them, no one sees it, and they get into the polling place and a poll worker says you cannot wear that, should that person be able to leave, put it in their car, come back and vote? Or does that mean that that person is done for the day, having violated electioneering laws?
No, absolutely not. No, nobody will lose their ability to vote for this reason. If and people make mistakes, you might be wearing a shirt or a hat and just kind of forget about it. And what looks like happened in that video, what should happen is poll workers should inform the voter that they're not allowed to wear political paraphernalia inside the electioneering zone and inside the polling place, and they should be given an opportunity to correct that. So, for example, if you're wearing a hat, you could certainly take that hat off, tuck it in your pocket or your purse or your backpack, and proceed with voting. If you have a shirt, you should be able to quickly turn that shirt inside out, take it off, put it back on. You should be able to continue, and you certainly would be able to leave the polling place and change your clothes or leave that item outside and then proceed back into the polling location. So nothing about that should impede your ability to vote. It's just a matter of, it's part of the duty to maintain order at a polling place and make sure that nobody feels uncomfortable or intimidated.
When someone perhaps pulls up in the parking lot or walks to their polling place, and there is a line, that electioneering line, behind which supporters of one candidate or another, or supporters of an issue, must stand. If they're behind that line, can they at that point express whatever political views they may have? And where is the line regarding coercion or intimidation?
Sure. Absolutely. Outside of the electioneering zone, you have full First Amendment right to express your political preferences. And I think the line really is, it's one thing to say what you support, is one thing to advocate for your own preferences. But if you're putting somebody down, or if you're berating them, or if you're attacking them verbally, that then crosses the line for their preferences and for their beliefs. You're then intimidating them, or just trying to dissuade them from voting with the way that they want to vote, and that's illegal. And it is there is a gray area there, but I think it's the standard for what is intimidating is a subjective standard. It is it's what a reasonable person experiences intimidating, and certainly if somebody does in fact feel intimidated, that is real, and that's their experience of it. So, for example, if you were to experience intimidation, you felt intimidated, and you called the Election Protection 866 Our Vote hotline, you can file a report with one of our nonpartisan volunteers, and then it would go to an attorney like myself, who then gets to follow up and investigate. We would perhaps give you a phone call and follow up and try to get a more detailed account of what happened. And we could even take your declaration, which would be a sworn statement that we could then use to try to do some advocacy and potentially even litigation to try to stop unlawful conduct. And our first step would be to make sure that election officials are aware of this. And one of the things that we've been working hard on this year is election officials typically understand that they have a responsibility to maintain order at polling places and prevent electioneering within that electioneering line and inside the polling place. But they also have a duty to maintain order more broadly, and they have a duty to prevent voter intimidation, which can involve, and if certainly in the video you shared, there looked like a physical altercation. Sometimes law enforcement has to get involved. We certainly don't want to have a law enforcement presence at the polls, because that itself can be intimidating to voters, especially voters of color. But we do, in some circumstances, you have to make sure that people are able to vote. And if there's, physical disturbance or something that is obstructing people's ability to vote, that needs to be addressed. And we don't want people to leave. We don't want to see voters who are dissuaded from voting or intimidated from voting. And we want to make sure that everybody who's there can cast their ballot, freely and comfortably without fear.
I have a question, and I've always had this question about election protection, phone numbers, organizations, nonpartisan, and the like. So if someone has not participated in early voting and they decide to show up on November 5th, and for some reason there is a problem with them being unable to vote, if they call 1-866 Our Vote and there is an issue, is it not possible that that issue may not be resolved before the poll closes?
Well, there are a number of issues that a voter could experience. And I think, first of all, when you call that number, you're going to be speaking with a trained legal volunteer who's going to first work to understand the issue you've experienced and try to help you resolve that issue on the call. So, for example, if you go to a polling place and you're not on the rolls, one of the first steps would be to confirm that that was in fact the correct polling place. And if not, then they'll help you figure out your correct polling place to go to. That would be a relatively easy issue to resolve. If you show up and you're not on the rolls, and the volunteer helps you look up your voter registration status, and it turns out you're not registered or no longer registered, you would still have the ability to go to your polling place and cast a provisional ballot. Federal law requires that every voter be allowed to cast a provisional ballot that will be adjudicated after the election. So in most cases, this would be a simple process. You fill out the provisional ballot and it gets set aside, and then your eligibility will be determined later. So in some cases, for example, there are some states that have a certain identification requirement at the polls, and if you've got your ID, you need to be given the opportunity to vote a provisional ballot. You can also go get your ID and come back, and certainly that would be the preference if you can, because then you can cast a regular ballot that won't need any other steps. But even if you can't, let's say, for example, you go to vote after work, you realize you don't have your ID and you won't be able to return with your ID in time to vote, then you still can cast that provisional ballot, and then you'll be able to follow up and provide that proof of ID after the election. So I think the biggest message for voters is you don't leave without voting. If you find yourself in a situation where you're not sure that you'll be able to return and vote a regular ballot, cast that provisional ballot. Make sure that you're required to be offered one. If a poll worker is resistant about that, you can say federal law, the Help America Vote Act requires you to be provided a provisional ballot. Most states have laws also. Not all states have laws similarly requiring voters to be provided a provisional ballot upon request. But again, you call the hotline, the volunteer will help work through your situation, whatever that may be. One of the things that always occurs, and it's nothing nefarious, polls open late sometimes if there might be a technical issue or a machine issue. Sometimes they run out of ballots, sometimes machines are down, and election officials work very, very hard to prevent this. But of course, it's going to happen in some places at some times. And in those situations, we can actually go to court and get an emergency order that would allow that polling place to stay open later. So for example, polls are supposed to be open from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. and a polling place doesn't open until 8 a.m. We're able to go and ask a court to extend the hours at the end of the day by the amount of time that it was open earlier. For example, in this case, 2 hours. One of the things that one of the challenges for this sometimes is courts will want to see. They'll want to see not just the documentation that, yes, this poll didn't open on time, but they'll want to see a documentation of voters who were affected by this. So, for example, if you show up to vote in the morning and the polling place hasn't opened yet and you have to leave to go to work, call the election protection hotline and let them know that. Because if you're able to return after work, for example, if you weren't able to return during normal poll hours, but you would be able to return during extended poll hours, that would be an extremely important piece of evidence that we could present to the court to justify them issuing an order. So voter information, 866-HOUR-VOTE, reporting an issue, 866-HOUR-VOTE, and helping us get a resolution that's going to help you vote and help other voters vote, 866-HOUR-VOTE also is a resource for that.
I do want to ask you about something that came out of the Department of Justice last Friday. And I know that your primary focus has obviously been this Virginia case, but I want to share something that the DOJ wrote. And the department said that it is monitoring compliance with federal voting rights laws in Prince George's County during early voting and on election day. Now, this press release goes on to say that the Justice Department enforces the federal voting rights laws that protect the rights of all citizens to access the ballot. The department regularly deploys its staff to monitor for compliance with federal civil rights laws in elections in communities all across the country. It did not say why Prince George's County was selected for this political season. Do you have any insight as to how voting jurisdictions are picked for federal monitoring by the DOJ? And is it a random thing? Is it that there is something that voters and journalists should keep an eye on because it just seems to have come out of the blue?
No, it's definitely not random. So the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, has for decades deployed federal monitors, attorneys from the Department of Justice, in local jurisdictions across the country on election day, in order to make sure, and principally in areas that have large populations of voters of color because of the history of racial discrimination in voting in America, to ensure that federal laws are followed, to ensure that voters are able to participate and not being interfered with. And there could be a number of reasons why federal observers might be deployed to a particular jurisdiction. These could include, certainly a history of racial discrimination in voting in that particular jurisdiction. But it could also include, things like, mass challenges. One of the tactics of anti-voter activists in recent years has been to file mass voter qualification challenges in different jurisdictions, challenging the qualifications of voters on the basis of some, big data, faulty data program that they're using. And you may have heard of Eagle AI, and there's some other programs. And this has certainly accelerated in recent years. And so it's possible, I'm not familiar with it, it's certainly possible that Prince George's County or another county could have had a number of voters challenged. It might not have anything to do with history or the election officials in that jurisdiction. It could just be, activists have targeted voters in that jurisdiction. But I can't speculate on that particular area, but I do know there's many reasons why monitors might be deployed. They might have had a tip on social media that some jurisdiction is going to be targeted by anti-voter activists or other bad actors. So there's really the DOJ and the Civil Rights Division and the voting section of the Civil Rights Division. They're focused on ensuring that every eligible voter can vote freely and easily, not subject to intimidation. And again, focus in particular on ensuring that voters of color can vote because of the history of racial discrimination.
Do you know how that may be conducted? Do they kind of show up like a secret Santa shopper, or do they make their presence known?
They will be reaching out to election officials in those jurisdictions ahead of time to let them know. And they actually publish on their website the nationwide list of jurisdictions that they'll be focused on. And they do this in every election. So this is not specific to this cycle. So this is public information. There's nothing secretive about it. In fact, they want people to know that they're going to be there because they hope that it's a calming presence. They're not going to be uniformed law enforcement officers. They'll be in, just to suit their lawyers, and they're trained to be aware of and monitor for issues that might be a problem for voters.
You mentioned earlier about the presence of law enforcement at polling places and how that may impact communities of color and just those who may think that may be an intimidating factor. I will say, when I voted last Saturday, there was a police officer at the polling place, and in Baltimore City, having spoken to a source at the police department, I was told that they are providing overtime to make sure that there are officers at polling places. Obviously, Baltimore City is not a Wisconsin, it is not an Alabama, it's not a Mississippi, it's not a Missouri. It is in Maryland, and every state has its own particular idiosyncrasies around how voting is viewed and the like. But while I noticed it, and as a person of color, I did not feel intimidated. So again, is having a police officer or a sheriff's deputy, is that a good thing or a bad thing if they are operating in their official duties?
Well, again, what might be intimidating to one person might not to another. It's this subjective experience. What we've heard, the Lawyers Committee is a racial justice civil rights organization. We work with state and local partners all over the country. And it really is not just a state by state, but a local issue in terms of, the community's experience with law enforcement. And certainly any individual of any background might feel intimidated by law enforcement's presence, or might feel safer if there is law enforcement presence. And certainly if there's a polling place or a jurisdiction where there has been disruptions at polling places, where there have been anti-voter activists operating or trying to intimidate, and potentially even berating, physically interfering with, I can imagine that it would be more maybe a calming presence to have law enforcement there. But again, it really is subjective because of the history of racial discrimination in this country, and in particular throughout the South, where law enforcement was used specifically in cases to impede access to the polls, by voters of color. There is a long history there, and we have heard from partners on the ground in many places that they would prefer not to have law enforcement there unless absolutely necessary. And undoubtedly, there might be circumstances where they're necessary.
Yeah,
but
that video that I showed earlier.
Sure. Yeah, and most, if not all, states have restrictions on where law enforcement can be unless invited. So they have this electioneering line, and unless they're invited by a poll worker or voting, and they're voting in the course of their day, but they're not acting in official capacity, they wouldn't be allowed to be in that area for the reasons mentioned. But in this case, and certainly in the video you showed, there's a physical altercation. It's disrupting the ability of voters to vote. That would certainly be a case in which the poll captain of the poll chief at that location would really need to invite law enforcement in to remove the disruption and address the disruption. So I don't know what happened in that case, but that would certainly appear to be a case in which law enforcement would be needed.
Since the voting season has gotten underway, in your capacity at the Lawyers Committee, have you found that there were more or fewer issues so far regarding questions about voter fraud or intimidation, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, I mean, it's fair to say that, since the 2020 cycle in particular, there have been, a rash of lies and conspiracy theories about voter fraud and various other aspects of that. And it's really become a cottage industry. It's become, a grift as far as, a number of individuals who are, really trying to promote this for their own personal gain, for their own political gain. And, but honestly, this is nothing new. The lies about voter fraud have been used for generations as justification for restrictive voting laws. And especially in the modern era, after the Civil Rights era, where we got some really strong legal protections, in principally the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but also the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1957, and other laws that outlawed, kind of official racial discrimination in voting. There has been a shift to using the specter of voter fraud or ineligible voters voting again as justification for passing new restrictions on voting. And you've really seen this accelerate first since the Supreme Court in 2013 in Shelby County v. Holder struck down a key provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which required jurisdictions, states and local jurisdictions with a history of racial discrimination in voting to get pre-clearance from the U.S. Department of Justice for any voting change that might have a discriminatory impact. And that prevented the enactment of thousands of laws in dozens of states over or dozens of jurisdictions over many, many years. That provision was struck down in 2013. And since then, many states, in fact, beginning the day of the ruling, many states that would have been previously covered have passed restrictive voting laws that have a discriminatory impact on voters of color. Many of those laws have been struck down in the courts, but now we need to actually go through litigation to do that, which can take some time. So it's fair to say that modern voter suppression is like death by a million cuts. There are so many little things that can contribute to various burdens on voters that can make it harder to vote. But the fact of the matter is, all of the evidence shows that voter fraud is exceedingly rare to the point of being vanishingly rare or non-existent. And there's a hysteria now, and lies being told about quote unquote non-citizen voting, but all of the evidence shows that this simply does not happen. Non-citizens do not vote. Non-citizens do not register except in occasionally rare instances where they might check the wrong box. The DMV, Virginia, for example, that just disenfranchised many eligible voters, based on these lies. They haven't had a single instance of confirmed non-citizen voting in 20 years. In Georgia, a couple of weeks ago, they did an audit of their voter rolls and only found 20 non-citizens registered out of over 8 million. So this is simply not an issue, and the people talking about it know it's not an issue. That's why it's not just a lie; it's a pernicious lie because the people telling it know it's false, and they're doing this again to drum up support for restrictive voting laws, to cast doubt on the outcomes of elections if they don't go their way, and it was really damaging to voters. It's intimidating to voters, and in the course of the Virginia litigation, we spoke with a number of voters, naturalized citizens, immigrants to this country, worked hard. Had fulfilled their dream of becoming an American citizen and want to participate and have been participating in our elections. And all of a sudden they feel targeted and they feel that they're being made to feel like they don't have the same rights that a citizen born in the United States has to vote, which is absolutely wrong. Every U.S. citizen has the same right to vote as any other. And it's something that we work every day to push back on, both in the courts and through election protection, making sure voters have the information that they need to vote, and also that they feel confident in voting. And that really needs to be, the message here is that, eligible voters deserve to vote. They have the right to vote. That vote needs to be protected. And it's up to the voters to exercise that right. So, voters should feel comfortable and confident in exercising their right to vote. And if they do have any questions or if they experience any issues, they can call election protection at 866-OUR-VOTE and get an answer and get support.
And as you pointed out before we started our conversation, this is just not in English, but there are several multilingual options for those where English may not necessarily be their first language.
Yes, yeah. So 866-OUR-VOTE is the English language hotline. There's also 888-WHUR-FM in Spanish. Mm-hmm. There's also 844-YALA-US in Arabic. And there's also 888-API-VOTE, which provides language support in Bengali, Cantonese, Hindi, Korean, Mandarin, Punjabi, Tagalog, Urdu, and Vietnamese.
Wow.
So these are great resources, and they're all coordinated, making sure that the volunteers that are taking these calls have up-to-date information about the law. They have even more up-to-date information about things that happened in the last couple of days, like if there was a polling place change or so this is a really great resource for voters, both to provide information and again to report any issues that they may have experienced.
I'll have to have that be the final word. Ryan Snow with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, the Voting Rights Project. Thank you so much for all of the information and your expertise. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Harold. It's time to vote.
Sure. That is the Daily Drum for this Thursday, October 31st. I'm Harold Fisher. Good night.